up?
So you might want to drop that desktop audio sound down a little bit because it's in the yellow. I just don't want it to like clip or something.
Look okay?
I think so. I hope so.
You had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it.
This was just scattering money around to build gazebos and fake lakes. The one you bought, you can't build.
You try to open up the treaty, you can lose everything.
And don't try to paper over what's happening in people's lives.
It's still time for a change. We had to take over the mess that you left us.
It's not economically disastrous. It's a smart economic thing to do.
An agreement between Quebec and Canada was always impossible.
It's very unclear, Mr. Don't use gobbledygook.
Live from Gatineau, Quebec, this is the 2021 Federal Leaders Debate. We're coming to you from the Grand Hall in the Canadian Museum of History on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people, a place for Canadians to reflect on the country's past. But tonight, we are looking ahead to the future. Good evening, I'm Shachi Curl. I'm the president of the Angus Reid Institute, and tonight I will be your moderator. Let's welcome the party leaders. Justin Trudeau for the Liberal Party. Aaron O'Toole for the Conservative Party.
He's already
Yves-François Blanchet of the Bloc Québécois.
A pleasure.
Jagmeet Singh of the NDP. And Annamie Paul for the Greens. Welcome, leaders.
The Greens.
I think I see how her name is.
Tonight's event is being produced for the Leaders Debates Commission by a media partnership including APTN News, CBC News, CTV News, and Global News. The debate is also offered in 10 other languages, including Cree, Inuktitut, Dene, as well as described video and ASL. 20,000 Canadians have weighed in telling us what they want to hear from the leaders, and 5 themes have emerged: leadership and accountability, climate change, reconciliation, affordability, and COVID recovery. Tonight, 4 undecided journalists, rather 4 undecided voters and journalists, maybe the journalists are undecided as well, will be putting their questions directly to the leaders. And you leaders, you've agreed to tonight's rules and format. So before we begin, please answer the questions you're asked. Do not interrupt each other. I don't want to cut you off, but I will if I have to. Okay?
Preferential designation.
All right, let's get started.
Extra languages, usually, except maybe for First Nations. It's not like America.
You will each get a different question, and you have 45 seconds to answer. You all have a countdown clock. The theme is leadership and accountability. Your speaking order has been determined by draw. And Mr. Singh, you are first. Hi, Mr. Singh.
Hi there.
Mr. Singh, you are popular and you inspire many Canadians, but your platform is full of big promises. And when it comes to how you'll pay for it all, there's not a lot of details. Given this, how can Canadians know that you are really ready to lead?
I really appreciate the question, and I want to say good evening to everyone tuning in. There is a serious question that people are asking themselves in this election. They're wondering who's going to pay the price of this pandemic and the recovery. And we do have bold plans about how we can invest in people. But we are the only party with a credible plan that will not put the burden on people, that will not cut the help that they need, unlike Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole, who voted against making the ultra-rich pay their fair share. We believe that billionaires should pay their fair share. We should end the loopholes and the offshore tax havens that mean billions of dollars are lost, that we are not able to invest in people. We want to put the burden on those that are at the very, very top so we can invest in the solutions that people need, tackling the climate crisis, investing in housing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Singh. Next to you, Mr. Trudeau. Because you wanted a new mandate, you plunged the country into an election even as the pandemic spurs thousands of new cases. But over the last 18 months...
he really regrets that. Calling for new elections.
Oh yeah, now
he thought he was going to get like a bit, like basically get a majority, and then he's getting
just
slapped.
Tired of ruling, man.
I mean, he didn't have a majority before. He was still ruling a minority government. But he had a pretty good amount of seats.
The largest party, though.
Right, but it's still not ruling. He still had to create a, like a
coalition.
Yeah, a coalition government. So
I forget how Canada works. I don't know if you need to like form a coalition to form a government. Do you? I forget.
I mean, it's. I would say it's like I'm not sure, but I know you would still like have to de facto form some sort of coalition to get anything passed, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know. My point being that he definitely regrets that.
Probably. Yeah. Well, polls of. I mean, Afghanistan was like a big thing, but COVID is also just a nightmare. But
yeah.
I don't know. Maybe he's just tired, man.
Good. He should step down.
Months, opposition parties have largely stood with you, putting the nation above politics. Why aren't you doing the same? How can you justify an election at this time?
Thank you, Ms. Curl. I think, first of all, I want to thank Canadians for being here tonight, making an important choice, and also, quite frankly, for everything you've done over the past number of months to help get ourselves and our neighbors through this. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, you're going to hear some very, very different and very strong ideas that are radically different about how we're going to move forward through this pandemic to end it, how we're going to build back better. Those decisions are going to be taken by your government now, in the coming weeks, this fall, not a year from now, not 2 years from now.
Could it not have waited a few months, Mr. Trudeau?
I know you want to go harder and faster on vaccinations. I know you want to go harder and faster on climate change, and you get to choose exactly that in this election.
All right, that's time. Thank you. Mr. Blanchet, to you. You deny that Quebec has problems with racism, yet you defend legislation such as Bills 96 and 21, which marginalize religious minorities, Anglophones, and Allophones. Quebec is...
I mean, everyone knows that. I just want to say the fact that she's mixing racism and religious secularism. That sounds like an oxymoron. The secularism that basically Quebec is super, super famous for, I really disagree with. I think that you can be whatever race you want, but religion is a separate thing. And if Quebec wants to make itself like an ultra-secular place, like that has nothing to do with race. That has to do with being anti-religious.
Right. It still could be discriminatory, but
that's not discriminatory against race.
Right. Yeah.
So she's just totally misframing it.
She's just conflating two things that are not necessarily related.
And language too. The fact, I mean, like Quebec, I don't agree with their like crazy francophone stuff, but. That's not race. That's like
language.
Yeah, that's language. Like, stop fucking mixing everything into one category.
That's easier. It's easier to like throw everything like in one giant slop against the wall. I think laziness.
She's a sloppy journalist.
Lazy journalism.
Is recognized as a distinct society, but for those outside the province, please help them understand why your party also supports these discriminatory laws.
Very familiar.
The question seems to imply the answer you want.
I like him.
Those laws are not about discrimination.
Oh, hell yeah.
They are about the values of Quebec.
And yet religious minorities, sir, cannot progress if they wear their religious gear.
Quebec is not recognized as a distinct society. It's been recognized as a nation on June 16th by the Parliament. 281 votes said that Quebec is a nation, and everybody here seems to agree with that. No more distinct society, which never had any meaning anyway. Meaning, not meeting.
So, again, why the discriminatory laws and your support for it, sir?
You may repeat as many times as you want that those are discriminatory laws. We are saying that those are legitimate laws that apply on Quebec territory, and there seems to be people around here who will share this point of view, which is a gain by itself for Quebec.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Ms. Paul, to you.
I fucking like this guy.
For millions of voters, this is the climate change election. But at this critical time, you've been bogged down in internal strife. If your own party doesn't fully support you,
Canadian People's Party of Canada, PPC, yeah.
Which is funny. I looked at their policy platform and don't agree with most of it.
I'd like to see where you fit on the spectrum.
I think that test was kind of bunk, but
I thought it was accurate because I do agree with the Bloc Québécois on basically everything except for separatism. But like that's their biggest policy is separatism. So.
Right. So what you're saying is you're a one-issue voter.
I'm saying I agree with them on everything except their one issue.
I know, I'm just kidding.
Which is ironic.
How can Canadians trust you to lead through one of the most defining issues of our times?
It's an excellent question, and it's an honor to be here tonight on the unceded territories of the Algonquin peoples. It has been a very difficult period, and do I wish that our party had been further ahead, particularly at this moment? Absolutely. Do I believe that we have wonderful candidates running all over the country that you should consider voting for? Absolutely. Being who I am and in this position has been incredibly hard. Being here tonight was not an obvious thing. I've had to crawl over a lot of broken glass to get here. I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to be the first of my kind, and because I am the first of my kind, I know that I won't be the last.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. And to you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole, you recommend vaccinations, but you won't make your candidates get them. You have a climate plan, but you won't dump a candidate that shares climate conspiracies. You're on record supporting the LGBTQ2 community, but you allowed half your MPs to vote against legislation protecting them. Tell me, how can voters trust that it's you and not your caucus that will be in charge of a conservative policy agenda?
Well, thank you, Ms. Curl. I'm a new leader of the Conservative Party, and we have a plan to get the country back on its feet after a difficult 18 months in this crisis. I'm a pro-choice ally to the LGBTQ community. That comes from my service in the military, where I served alongside people from all backgrounds, all orientations, putting the country first. And our platform, including a detailed plan on climate change, is about making sure we secure the future, jobs, accountability, national leadership on mental health.
So is it you, sir, or your caucus that's driving the bus?
I am driving the bus to make sure we get this country back on track, and I'm here to defend the rights of all Canadians, women, members of the LGBTQ community, Indigenous Canadians. I want to make sure we all secure a future together.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. All right, leaders, thank you. It is now time for our first face-to-face debate. Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Paul, you're up. Starting with Mr. Trudeau, based on this question. You call yourself a feminist, but on your watch, sexual misconduct in Canada's armed forces continues to run rampant. Tell me, why are you allowing these unacceptable conditions to continue?
I think we recognize that there are systems and institutions that need to change across the country, and that's why from the very beginning, we stepped up with policies, new policies, stronger policies and processes to support every survivor, everyone who comes forward, because nobody deserves to work in a workplace where they are being discriminated against, where they are being harassed or hassled. We have been unequivocal about that. My leadership has been unequivocal about that. Yes, these problems continue in workplaces across the country, particularly in the military. That's unacceptable, which is why we've taken even stronger measures. It's unsatisfactory to have to say, we're relying on process in this. We want to just be able to have easy answers.
Ms. Paul, what's your response to that?
With easy answers. You have to fall back on process.
Using, like most politicians,
I have said
rhetoric.
I didn't even get the question they asked to Anna-Me, which is like, why should we trust you? It's like, why should we trust anybody? It's like kind of a weird question.
It's a bad question. But
I mean, because she's bald?
Maybe, but I think everyone should hashtag trust bald people because bald people, they're the best. I mean, I think that goes without saying. Most of them. Name me one evil bald person.
Mao.
You can't do it.
Mao.
No, he still tried to keep his hair. I'm talking about
balding.
I'm talking about people who. That's balding. This is different.
Fully bald.
Stop trying to lump us all into one category, Ari.
Before, and I'll say again tonight, that I do not believe that Mr. Trudeau is a real feminist. A feminist doesn't continue to push strong women out of his party when they are just seeking to serve. And I will say their names tonight and thank them. Thank you, Jane Philpott. Thank you, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Thank you, Selena Cesar-Chavez. And I'm here tonight thanks to the work that you have done. I believe that if there were more women on this platform tonight and in previous years, that we, in fact, would have better laws in our military. We would have childcare at this point. We would have many of the things that we need. I am the only woman other than Elizabeth May to be on this platform in the last 18 years. The Liberal Party has never had a woman lead it. I think it's time for the party to examine its priorities.
I think, Ms. Hall, you'll perhaps understand that I won't take lessons on caucus management from you. And I think what I will keep focused on is making sure that our first woman finance minister has moved forward on
all right, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, I'm sorry, that's time. We have to move on.
Cabinet.
Mr. Blanchet, Mr. O'Toole, and Mr. Singh, this next topic is for you to debate. Canada's transition to a green economy depends on pipelines. At a time when Ontario and Quebec face uncertain energy supply over Line 5, this country cannot extract nor distribute oil domestically. Our theme is leadership. Tell me, which one of you is best to lead on these complex issues? Mr. Blanchet, per the draw, you begin.
I'm not very much interested in leading Canada. However, I am very much interested in making sure that Quebec is entitled to...
Wait, did you hear when he said that? Because he knows he's not going to win. He's like, I'm not very interested in leading Canada. Because he knows nobody's going to vote for him from outside Quebec.
Yeah, I mean, who's going to vote for a separatist party? Like, I mean, besides the people inside the territory that wants to separate.
I guess. Yeah, they should just drop the separatism. Like, I think it's kind of like dated.
I would say if you really want to separate, like, do it like small policies. Don't try to vote for independence. But whatever they can.
They had 2 referendums and they lost both of them.
Yeah.
That was my dad told me this is the first time he ever voted was to vote against the separation of Quebec from Canada.
Oh yeah.
Because he was in he was living in Quebec at the time.
Yeah.
Its own vision for the future. You know, in Quebec, we do not have energy issues that much because we are lucky. We are lucky. It's a bit of luck that we can produce green energy in a large amount. But the whole planet cannot afford this idea, this very Canadian idea, this very conservative idea, and as far as I know, this very liberal idea that we have to produce more oil, export more oil, believing that the money from it will reduce gas emission, which won't happen.
All Canadian families deserve an economic recovery, including families in Western Canada that feel left out after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau. When it comes to leadership, our natural resources sector is a leader in environmental social governance. Anytime Canadian resources are removed from the global supply chain, you know who fills that gap? Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia. Well, all of these organizations and companies are getting their emissions down. Let's get emissions down and Canadian resources to market so that we can have jobs, opportunity, and fight climate change.
Mr. Singh.
When it comes to leadership on the fighting this essential crisis, one of the biggest crises we're up against, we've got a difficult choice for Canadians. You've got on one side someone who doesn't believe there's a crisis, and then on the other you got Mr. Trudeau who doesn't act like there's a crisis. And what it's going to take is real leadership. Because the solutions are there. We can invest in green energy, clean energy. We can invest in renewable energy.
Doesn't give up on tens of thousands of workers across the country.
We'll never give up on workers. We're
workers that are working hard for their families, so we can get our resources to market.
Okay, one at a time, gentlemen. Mr. O'Toole, then back to you, Mr. Singh. Mr. O'Toole, then Mr. Singh.
I want to see Canadians get back to work in all sectors and in all regions. And I'm proud of what we produce in our country, whether it's our resources or the resources in the heads of our young people. We need to get emissions down and get our energy to market.
These workers need a plan that's going to create jobs for the future. And that's a responsibility of government. We've seen 6 years of Mr. Trudeau, and workers can't afford another 4 years. What we need to do is invest in a diversified economy, clean energy. We need to electrify transportation. We need to invest in retrofitting homes and buildings. We need to create good jobs for workers now.
But we need an economic recovery in all sectors
that have failed workers.
Last word to you, Mr. Blanchet. Last word to you, sir.
Leadership is not only saying the words, it's proposing solutions, admitting a problem, which they're not doing.
All right, thank you. My next question is for all of you. We've had some encouraging news out of Kabul overnight with the escape of 43 Canadians. That said, thousands of people who helped Canada during Canada's mission in Afghanistan have been left behind in their out.
I remember, in the previous elections, a lot of Quebecois people obviously are not separatists, and because they know, he's not going to like win. He's not going to get a majority in parliament, right? So it's not really a threat. So periodically, when they have a good candidate, they'll vote for him. But if not, then they'll vote for NDP, or usually Québécois are quite far to the left, so they'll vote for like another left-leaning party.
Right.
So in the last couple of elections, the bloc, I can't remember 15, but I remember in 13, 12, whenever the previous election was, they fled to the NDP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hour of need, and it is unknown if we will ever get them all out. To each of you, what would you have done differently? Mr. O'Toole, per the draw, you begin.
Canada should never leave behind people that are at risk because they helped us. When Afghanistan was falling, there were 1,200 Canadians and hundreds more translators and others waiting for help from Canada. What did Mr. Trudeau do? You called an election, sir. You put your own political interests ahead of the well-being of thousands of people. Leadership is about putting others first, not yourself. Mr. Trudeau, you should not have called this election. You should have gotten the job done in Afghanistan.
Mr. O'Toole, as of the beginning...
Hold on. This is not open debate, leaders. This is a situation where we're asking a question to each of you. No problem, Mr. Trudeau. I'm trying to keep track myself.
I would like him, Ms. Curl, because he called an election in the fourth wave of a pandemic with fires in British Columbia and with unfinished business in Afghanistan,
All
Mr.
right,
Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I'm going to give the opportunity next per the draw to Mr. Singh. You guys will have tons of time to debate, so hang tight. Mr. Singh.
Sadly, what's happened in Afghanistan is a tragedy that was something we knew about. We knew about the withdrawal date. We knew from President Biden what that date would be. And sadly, I agree with Mr. O'Toole on this one point that it was a bad decision to call an election while this crisis was going on, particularly because we've got allies on the ground that put their lives at risk to support our Canadian forces who are now looking at peril for their lives and may never get out of Afghanistan. We know the impact on women and girls in Afghanistan. It's heartbreaking, and it could have been avoided. Veterans had told Mr. Trudeau and his government for a long time that the current approach was not working. Those calls were not heeded, and as a result, we're in this really horrible situation.
Thank you,
it could have
Mr.
been avoided.
Singh. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Blanchet.
First, good news. I seem to understand from what I read a few hours ago that Kabul airport is now being open for some people to get out of the country, which is very good news. This should have been worked a long, long time ago. I agree with Mr. O'Toole that Mr. Trudeau should have put those people's interest before his own. However, the problem is that Canada has failed many times to create some strong partnerships with other countries in order to be stronger facing a situation like Afghanistan now, because by itself, we must admit, Canada is not a world power.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. Trudeau, I invite you to respond now.
Thank you, Ms. Curl. It's unfortunate to hear the members, the leaders on this stage talking down the incredible work that our Canadian Armed Forces, that our diplomats, that our consular officials did from the beginning of the summer to ensure that as of the very beginning of August, well before this election, we were getting flights out of Afghanistan. We got 3,700 people out of Afghanistan, and over the past weeks...
I'm so upset that you're criticizing the armed forces and all this stuff.
Of course, man. It's a good rhetorical tool.
Yeah, but if they point it out or if people see that, it looks really weaselly, which I think Trudeau's a pretty weaselly guy. So he's a very, put more nicely, he's a very classic, like well-studied politician.
A little monster, little green goblin.
We've been working with the Qataris, for example, on exactly that good news that we've seen of more people, more Canadians getting out of Afghanistan. We work closely with our allies because we know...
Did you see just now, there's a board behind them that shows how long each of them has talked so far.
I saw that.
Okay. It's kind of cool.
Canadians sacrificed in Afghanistan for a better future. We need to stand by the people who helped us, who helped themselves, and we will with even more people coming to Canada in the coming months.
All right, Mr. Trudeau. Ms. Paul.
As a former diplomat and with a husband who provided advice on the peace negotiations in Afghanistan, we were hearing the stories all the time in the months leading up that this was foreseeable. And so it seems like we got better information on our smartphones than Mr. Trudeau got from our entire intelligence service based on what he's saying. The thing is that when people count on you, when you make a promise to them, then you do it so that people can count on Canada's word. When someone is your partner, you go with them, you go for them, or you don't amount to much. And so leaving behind people in Afghanistan, rocking up to Rideau Hall and calling an election under these circumstances was not the right thing to do. And to borrow a line from Mr. Singh from 2019, Mr. Trudeau could just say, hey, man, I messed up.
All right, Ms. Paul, thank you very much.
All
thank
right.
you all. And now it is our time for a first attempt at open debate. Jumping off of this question, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been in Chinese prisons for 1,004 days. The next Prime Minister has key decisions to make about our already tense relationship with China, such as telecommunications security and foreign investment. Some say this all comes down to a trade-off between Canada's economic growth and recognition of human rights. I'd like to know where you all stand. I'm sure you want to exchange on that. Mr. Singh, per the draw, you begin. Leaders, you may jump in.
Thank you very much. We know that we can't imagine what it is for Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig to be going through 1,000+ days in a prison without access to human rights. I can't imagine what their friends and their families are going through right now. All I know is we have to do everything possible to secure the release of these two Canadians. We need to work with our allies, apply pressure, and make sure that we return these Canadians home. That's what we've got to do.
And that's exactly what we've been doing. Over the past 3 years, we have worked.
Just check how he's standing there. Look at this guy.
That's a power stance right there. That's power stance.
With international allies to put pressure on China in every single one of their meetings. We've worked closely with the United States. We at the G7 a few weeks ago worked with the international community to make sure we're moving forward on challenging China where necessary in human rights, competing with them economically where we need to, and holding them to account on the rule of law as a global community. And Canada's voice has been very strong on that.
Canada's voice has been absent, Mr. Trudeau. We have not worked with our allies on Huawei. We have not stood up for the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. We've not fought for the two Michaels and put pressure on the communist regime. We have not stood up for human rights. Sir, you did not show up for a vote declaring a genocide towards the Uyghur people. You didn't show up. Canada is the country that was leading the fight against apartheid. We created the UN Human Rights Code. We should be leaders for our values, sir. And you've let the Michaels down, and we have to get serious with China.
If you want to let the Michaels and get the Michaels home, you do not simply lob tomatoes across the Pacific. That is what Mr. Harper tried for a number of years and didn't get anywhere. You need to engage in a sophisticated way with our allies every step of the way.
You have to take the same position on Huawei,
and that's exactly
on steel,
what we have done
on
every step of the time.
Cyber security, Mr. Trudeau. We are out of step, and our allies are wondering where Canada's gone. You started as Prime Minister saying you admired China.
I'm coming to you, Ms. Paul. Just a second. I want to get to Mr. Singh, and then to you, Ms. Paul.
I appreciate, thank you very much, the opportunity. I want to also we're talking about leadership and accountability. And in this pandemic, one of the moments I think of leadership that has been a failure is the fact that when we talk about leadership, it means finding solutions. And in our long-term care homes here in Canada, we saw the worst conditions in
Mr. Singh, we're going to have time to chat with that later. The topic is China, human rights, and economic growth. To you, Ms. Paul.
He could have tied it together if he was
and
it's
this
all
is
because
an
it came
area
from a
where certainly lines are being redrawn all across the world. And the main...
I am curious about the NDP's stance on China because they're all obviously the furthest left-leaning besides maybe the Green Party.
Yeah.
So I wonder what stance they would take on dealing with China because he completely... Maybe he didn't want to respond to it. He purposely changed the
It's possible. I mean, he was trying to talk about leadership, and I think he feels like he has, maybe because of I don't know exactly what his stance is, but maybe because he feels like he has a lighter position and that wouldn't be favorable in this, that he, like on COVID, they have a better response.
Maybe.
So I'm not sure, but I would also like to hear more about like where they actually stand and what their policies.
I'd like to hear what the Bloc says.
Yeah.
Main thing that
we should nuke the Chinese. We turn Beijing into parking lot.
But they don't have nukes. I don't think Canada has nukes.
Whatever. We start a clandestine nuclear program.
That's not a bad idea.
Canada is going to have going forward in terms of currency is its word. When we make a promise, we have to keep those promises. That's how, when we need help, we get it. You know, my mom grew up on a farm in a small community, and she learned very young and taught us that you have to give your word to your neighbors, and they have to be able to count on it so that when you need help, they're there for you. And so when we don't show up, when we're asked for vaccines from COVAX, and then we take vaccines from COVAX, when the Uyghur ask us for help to declare a genocide and we don't do that, when we don't show up on the climate by setting targets that are ambitious, but at the same time in line with our international partners and do our fair share, then our word doesn't count for much, and then it makes it very hard for us to help people like the Michaels when they need us the most.
Mr. Blanchet, did you want to get in on
Chewing
this?
tomatoes might not be the solution. But I would submit humbly that doing nothing might not be the solution either. The Mr. Trudeau's record on human rights is not perfect. We might name the two Michaels, we might name Uyghur in Xinjiang, we might name Taiwan, Hong Kong, we might name
That's my boy.
Regiment, we might name the worst of all,
Mr. Blanchet.
Raif Badawi being still held in Saudi Arabia because Canada wants to sell weapon and military supply to Saudi Arabia, which is unacceptable. The Parliament voted.
Okay, gentlemen, one at a
2
time.
seconds. The Parliament voted unanimously to give citizenship to Raif Badawi. Nothing has been done afterward.
All right.
Relationship to who?
I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what he's saying.
Oh, whoa, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh.
Mr. Blanchet is correct. Canada is needed back on the world stage. We may be smaller than China with respect to population and economy, but we are a giant when it comes to our commitments to human rights, to dignity, and to the rule of law. And we have to start working with our allies to take a more serious approach for human rights, standing up for our workers on fair trade, and making sure that our voice is a principled one on the world stage again.
The problem with Mr. O'Toole and his principles is he says all the right-sounding things, and he's working on reassuring everyone that he's right there as a strong leader.
It's a serious
issue,
but it is just one issue. It's not.
It's also historical. Like, I think every country in the world has lots of historical failures from totally different governments.
For sure. And but what I'm saying is like, trying to like not be honest or like cover up or ignore that kind of history is like not great.
I'm not aware that there's any modern cover up.
It seems like a lot of people are like kind of trying to obfuscate it. I don't know.
I've heard at least Trudeau. It seems like he talks about it a lot. So
you know that he is also currently like I don't know if it's him. It's not him personally, I'm sure, but the government is like taking these people to court basically to like make sure that they don't get like reparations and stuff from a lot of these cases.
Yeah,
that's pretty shitty. But I mean, you also have to take the other side of the coin. I mean, they like a lot of people in Canada are declaring that what's happening in Xinjiang is a genocide, which is like more than you can say for a lot of countries.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying they're like horrible human rights abusers. Obviously, I'm just saying like
Canada also like. As far as reparations, I don't want to like start down that road, but they spend a shitload of federal money to help out First Nations communities all over Canada because they are so remote. They have so many social issues, and a lot of that was caused by being confined by basically taking them away from their historic ways of life. But on the other hand, I mean, you know, whale hunting is not, which was a part for certain First Nations communities was a large part of their economy and food base is not like something that most people are interested in nowadays. So
right, I mean,
or sustainable or feasible.
Right, but I mean, there's an argument to be made that a lot of these communities would have grown and developed and probably integrated more had you not like rip children away from their families and try to like anglify them and stuff. So
that's a fair argument, but the other thing is they are so remote. If you look at like how, I mean, you think America's big. If you look at how a good portion of like the population of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories lives more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest city with more than 1,000 people. It's like, I mean, it's so expensive and unsustainable to live in those conditions when they're not doing things like hunting and they were never farming. It was mostly hunting, but when they're not really hunting anymore and when they rely on basically imported oil and snowmobiles that are produced in the lower provinces and food imports, it's like it's very difficult. It's a huge sociological problem in Canada.
Yeah, it's something that there has to be some solution for, but it's also a relatively small amount of people.
It's a small amount of people, but it's a huge amount of territory.
Yeah, but I mean, like you said, it's remote, and like no one wants to really live there anyway. So
they just throw money at it, which is, I mean,
Right.
what they do. They're just like, okay, you guys live out there. You know, we're gonna provide, you know, clinics and I mean, obviously, everyone in Canada essentially has free healthcare.
Right.
And
free healthcare from the neck down is how I've heard it described a lot, because they don't have like dental or a vision care.
That's true, but
but it's obviously a lot better
neither do
than
we-
places like America.
Yeah, or prescription care.
Yeah.
Which is a problem.
It
But
is.
They might address it.
I'm sure they'll probably talk about it.
Convince his candidates to get vaccinated. He can't convince his MPs to
All
follow
right,
his
let's keep the theme,
pro-choice.
Mr. Singh. You wanted to get in. I'm giving the last word. I'm giving the last word to Mr. Singh. Mr. Trudeau, please. To you, Mr. Singh.
Leadership means standing up. It means standing up for the Uyghur in China. It means standing up to defend people around the world. It also means showing leadership when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. We've got the worst record under Mr. Trudeau in the G7. So that's not leadership. Certainly not.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, leaders. We are now moving on to our next theme, which is climate change.
That was too short talking about China.
At least it was early though. They got it. So all the people. That
All
get
right,
bored
this
of the
time we're
debate
starting
after,
with a
like, 30 minutes
question
will at
from
least have
Trevor
seen that.
McMullen. He is a high
for,
school
like, two of the
teacher in
parties
Lunenburg,
didn't
Nova
say much.
Scotia. He's standing by. Trevor, what's your question?
I would say I would have liked to have heard more from the Greens and NDP about their stance towards China. The Green leader, Anami, I keep forgetting her last name. Anyway, Anami Paul, maybe. At least she took a stance on recognizing the Uyghur
genocide,
genocide. But yeah, the NDP, I wish he would have said something.
He just kept saying like, stand up for the Uyghurs, recognize like their plight, which is, I don't know. It's hard to say. You'd have to see like an actual policy platform, and I don't know if like how many of the NDP voted to declare it a genocide either. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either.
Hey, good evening. As leader, what immediate actions would you take to make green technology more accessible and affordable so that everyday Canadians don't have to bear the financial burden of being environmentally ethical?
All right, thank you, Trevor. Leaders, you've heard Trevor's question. Ms. Paul, I apologize. Ms. Paul, you're going first.
Thank you so much for that question. And Trevor, that's exactly where your head should be at. That's where all of our heads should be at. How can we use this opportunity to?
What about it?
So why did she call her? Excuse me, Miss Paul?
Because she called her Mr. Paul.
Oh, I thought she said Mrs.
No, I think she said Mr. Paul.
Jesus Christ! I thought she said Mrs. And then
No. She said Mr. Paul.
That's okay. I misheard that.
Is it because I'm bald? Is that it, you fucking bitch?
Moment to create a green economy. How can we incentivize every single person in Canada, every company, and every enterprise to adopt green technologies? How can we become a global leader? And so, absolutely, if you look at our platform, you will see that we propose incentives all the way from buying electric cars, new and used, to retrofitting homes, to all of these items that will help make life easier for you and help for you to do your part. But this is a national and international issue. We need national leadership on it, and we need it across party lines.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh.
Thank you. Thank you, Trevor. I really appreciate the question. And I'm sure you speak to a lot of young people as a teacher and are seeing the fear in their eyes, the worry and the desperation that young people have because they don't know what type of future they're going to inherit. And they're worried about the impacts of the climate crisis because it's hurting us now and it's only going to get worse if we don't do anything about it. And to invest in that future, we need to make choices. And right now, we look at the choices Mr. Trudeau has made over the past 6 years. He has promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, but instead of ending them, he has increased them to $900 million per year.
Whoops.
That is money we could spend on investing in clean technology, in making it easier for people to access that technology and to do our part to fight the climate crisis. So it's a matter of choices. We can't afford another 4 years of Mr. Trudeau's choices.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. To you, Mr. O'Toole.
Bad choice, boy.
Thank you for the question, Trevor. I was raised by two strong women who were teachers, and they told me to be straight up. This is an area where the Conservatives, we had to win back some trust. We hadn't met the expectations of Canadians on climate change. It's an important issue for me as a father of a high schooler, and we talk about it all the time. That's why in April, long before the election, I put out a substantial package pricing carbon to meet our Paris targets And what's interesting, our low carbon
really
savings
interesting
account
that a
will allow
conservative
people to
would
actually
apply a
make
carbon
green
price.
choices to lower their carbon footprint. This approach is innovative because it would allow all Canadians to know what their carbon footprint is and make those innovative investments to lower it. I think we all have a role to play, and our plan is detailed and we'll deliver on it.
Mr. Blanchet.
Climate change.
Thank you to be with
we know
us, sir.
every
I
Canadian can
hope
look at
you
their carbon footprint.
appreciate
It's like,
a little.
that's such trash. Like 99% of carbon output is from like major corporations.
But if you raise the price, I'm surprised that he would even price it. If you raise the price as an industrial input, then it raises the cost overall, which means less will be consumed.
But it also means that a lot, like the people most affected by that are oftentimes like lower income people.
I mean, you could say that about anything in terms of cost.
Right. So you need to have like some sort of something to offset that, to make sure that like normal people aren't going to be the ones that bear the brunt of this, because it's not them that did it. Like it's corporations.
I mean, it kind of is. It's all of us.
It's corporations and government, but no.
It's
But
all of
like
us, man.
70% of emissions are from like 100 corporations
selling shit to the majority of people, though. Realistically, we're all responsible.
Yeah, but like to put it on like an individual and say like you can change this is like, it's nonsense.
We can. I mean, we can to some extent. People
to some extent, but I think a much quicker and easier way would be to regulate these companies.
I agree with you in principle, but absolving the average person of any responsibility, being like, oh, it's just the big corporations who fucking tricked you. It's like,
I'm not saying we absolve average people of any responsibility, but I think this like putting this impetus on the normal person is a joke, because corporations know and have historically known like what they're doing is like polluting and causing climate change, and they ignore it or cover it up.
I think both. I think both are very important. I think individual responsibility and like knowing and raising the cost, because like there's no reason that we should continue subsidizing people's shitty decisions, like through low gas taxes.
I agree, as long as
that don't reflect the climate costs.
Yeah, as long as you have legitimate alternatives, because I don't.
I mean, technologically, even if we don't, we should stop subsidizing it. Honestly,
that's fair. But I think
get a fucking bicycle. Like if it's too expensive, like.
I mean, but like,
I'm a poor person and I walk around everywhere because I simply don't have enough money. So I'm not anti-poor.
I know, but you also live in in a tropical island where there's not like a foot of snow on the ground in winter. So like it's a little bit different. But I agree with you. But again,
when I did live in Canada, I also walked. I walked an hour to go to the grocery store, trudging through the fucking snow. Like, it sucks being poor, and it sucks like.
Right. So we should. All I'm saying is that we should make being poor. One, we should end poverty. We but we should also make it easier on people who are poor. We shouldn't punish them even more.
I agree with you in principle, but we should stop subsidizing.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Which is essentially by keeping low gas taxes and basically like saying it's not we shouldn't impose any costs on carbon because it might disproportionately affect poor people.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I agree with you. I'm just saying the government also needs to make sure there are alternatives like public transportation.
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah, public transportation in Canada is much better than America, but it's also quite poor.
Yeah,
I would say.
So that's why I say in these subsidies to these billion-dollar corporations, and shift that money to improving infrastructure and trains, MRTs, subways, these things.
It's a joke, man. The fact, I mean, I lived in Toronto, which has the TTC, like has the MRT system, and that was very, very problematic. I remember going to class, and I remember very, very frequent outages. Like in Taiwan, I've almost never experienced an outage. I remember like several times where you'd just be like, everyone get off the train. There's a train on fire, like somewhere down the line, and now you can take these alternative buses. And then you stand in a huge line, and you're just delayed hours. I mean, this is like a common occurrence.
It's a joke.
It's, especially like if you're a working person.
Yeah, no kidding. Because you could, I mean.
We have what, like 2.5 lines basically in Toronto? It's basically, this is when I lived there, like 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But for a city with, I mean, the largest city by population in Canada. Like, Kaohsiung is like the third largest, and we've got 2 lines.
Yeah.
We've got 2 million people. Toronto's got like triple the population.
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
Stupid.
It is. We need to do better. I agree with you. More public transportation.
Hashtag build back better, folks.
But on the other hand, Toronto does have streetcars, which I think are nice. I am a fan of streetcars. I hated the Toronto streetcars. They're disgusting. But I like the idea of streetcars.
Yeah, the aesthetic.
Not the aesthetic, the idea, the fact that it's like because MRTs usually have fixed stops in streetcars because they can stop anywhere, represent kind of like a mixed mode of transportation that it gets you to like that. What do they call it? Like the last mile problem that happens with a lot of large transportation systems, and the streetcars can take you like, and not only that, but they travel on the existing infrastructure more or less. Yeah.
That's true.
I did not like them. I never liked them. I don't know why.
Dirty or?
They were definitely dirty. They were very crowded, although the MRT wasn't much better. Something about it just repulsive to me.
So you liked it, but we're also...
I like the idea of it, but I did not like Toronto streetcars.
That's fair.
I don't know why. I just didn't.
I don't really like a lot of public transportation, honestly. Because I get like sensory overload really easily on it. But
the streetcars are
I'm
nice
glad it's there, and I like to use it.
You would not like China, man. China...
Oh, no.
I remember... No, I mean, they're not... Some of the MRTs I took were not crowded, but what was interesting is like when you're underground, they'll put on these like displays that basically only when you're passing by at like 65 kilometers an hour can you actually like read the displays.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like you would think, oh, you know, you don't have sensory overload because there's nothing. You're under the ground. You know, you look out the window, there's nothing to see, right? But you're actually seeing advertisements blasted in your face through the windows.
Yeah. A lot of my sensory overload more comes from being crowded and like people being loud. Yeah, it's mostly people.
I would say the Chinese MRT was not that bad in my experience, and I went on quite a few MRT systems in obviously Shanghai, Nanzhou, what's Nanzhou? Nanjing, Suzhou, Beijing, Changchun.
Where else? Quite a bit.
Yeah. Public transportation is not bad there, considering.
Got a lot of lines.
Well, they got a lot of people, so it's kind of cheap.
I mean, yeah.
It's very cheap.
Kind of have to, right?
I remember the MRT. Some of these, like Suzhou, it's like two like renminbi, which is like nothing to go like quite a distance.
It's good.
It's really cheap.
It's smart to subsidize that stuff.
I agree.
Yeah.
Anyway.
A little bit blunt answers.
Oh, hell yeah.
First, you put a ceiling on any production of oil and gas. You take all the money that the federal government is placing into that industry, even more by the liberals than the conservatives before, and you put that into green energy. And you take the money for Trans Mountain and you give it to Alberta for Alberta to initiate its own transition toward a greener economy. This is the way to do things, because if we don't do that and keep dreaming about reducing gas emission while increasing production, we will never get there.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchette.
I have
Mr.
to say,
Trudeau.
I would probably vote for him.
Thank you, Trevor, for your question. From one teacher to another, I know that you need to ground your decisions and what you share with your students in science. And all these leaders on here have various claims about what their climate change plan is going to do. Unfortunately, if you look at what the experts and the climate scientists and the economists have said, we're the ones with the strongest plan to fight climate change. And how to answer your question specifically, how to make it more affordable for Canadians? Well, the first thing we did on that was bring in a national price on pollution that incentivizes businesses to go cleaner at the same time as it puts more money in families' pockets. We are going to put a cap on oil sands and oil and gas emissions and decline it until net zero and create those opportunities and investments that are going to make it more affordable for you and your students for many years to come.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Thank you, Trevor. Have a good evening. I'm turning it back to the leaders. It is time for more debate. The draw has Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole facing off. Your topic is climate change. Even today, 1 in 4 Canadians don't believe that climate change is caused by human activity. How can we achieve real progress when so many people are still debating the fundamentals? Mr. O'Toole, you begin.
Climate change is a real threat, not only to Canada and to the world. That's why we have to take a serious plan to tackle it. That's why, as I said, we put our plan out in April, because we had to restore some trust on this issue to make sure we can show Canadians we can get emissions down and get the economy working again. That is key. We have a plan to meet our Paris targets, but minimize the impact on jobs and investment. We're also going to make major investments in electric vehicles, in the hydrogen economy, small modular reactors. There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change. And you ask about how we're going to convince the quarter of Canadians who still don't think climate change is real. Well, Mr. O'Toole can't even convince his party that climate change is real because they voted against that. And that's perhaps why his plan is so weak. His plan is to go back to the Harper targets, to the Harper approach on fighting climate change, which doesn't work. His costed platform, which he just put out last night, cuts $2 billion from climate investments and from things. And for our friends in BC,
you have never made a target,
has proposed to restore
let him respond, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, let Mr. O'Toole respond to you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Curl.
The tanker ban.
Mr. Trudeau always forgets one fact. He has never made a target for climate change. He has great ambition. That's part of the reason we're in an election in a pandemic, is his ambition. He doesn't have achievement. Well, he never meets his targets. So we have a plan that we will meet the targets and get our country back to work.
Except for the fact that right now we are on track.
Gentlemen, we have to wrap this segment.
Over
all right,
target.
we are moving on. We are moving on, leaders. Next up is Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchette, and Ms. Paul. I'd like each of you to describe how you'll implement a national approach that best recognizes the significant regional differences involved in fighting climate change. You begin, Mr. Singh. You may jump in one at a time, please.
Of course.
Well, here's the thing. We just heard Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau argue about who's worse. And honestly, it's a tough question to answer. Let me tell you, you're not stuck with these two. Better is possible. We can invest in a clean economy. We can end fossil fuel subsidies. We can make sure we're creating clean transportation, and we can invest in provinces and territories to make sure they have the resources necessary to fight the climate crisis. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm going to be a dad soon, and I want to make sure my child grows up into a future that has the same opportunities that I had, that has clean air, clean water, a clean place to live. I want to make sure that that's
as far as I understand it, it is not a national or even less a regional issue. It is a planetary issue. And it has to be tackled by everybody at once. But I would be glad to give some of my precious time to Mr. O'Toole, because a week ago, a little more than that, he said in French that he did not want anymore to have a pipeline to go through Quebec. That was quite a statement. He said that in French, no more pipeline through Quebec. I want to hear that in English tonight. Please, please.
Well, Mr.
Hold on. This segment is
quite frankly, this
we're not going to let that happen.
This on the climate, this sort of approach is going to get us nowhere, and I mean but nowhere. It is, and the question was an excellent one. This is a global issue. This is a national issue. This is a nonpartisan issue, and we have got to be able to come together across party lines. I said that I was available for a debate just on the climate because it's that important, but we've invited many times all of the parties to join us in a joint cabinet, a cross-party cabinet, to deal with this the way that we dealt with the pandemic, together. People were so inspired to see these leaders come together in the early days of the pandemic. We have got to bring that same approach here. Let's come together because that's what's needed.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. We do need to come together. I can lay out what we shouldn't do and what we need to do. What we shouldn't do is what Mr. Trudeau did. Set targets and miss them. We shouldn't promise to end fossil fuel subsidies and then increase them. We shouldn't put a price on pollution and then exempt the biggest polluters. What we need to do is end those fossil fuel subsidies, invest in provinces and territories with infrastructure that's going to help us fight the climate crisis.
Hold on, Mr. Singh.
With the greatest of respect to
let Ms. Paul respond.
With the greatest of respect to Mr. Singh, we have been making this
in 2012 or 2013. They had a very unpopular Liberal candidate, Michael Ignatieff, and he hemorrhaged voters, and basically the NDP stole almost all of their. I'm not almost all of their electorate, but a good portion of it, and they became, I think, the second largest party. But because the two left-leaning parties both had big minorities, the Conservatives also managed to take a good portion of that, and that was why Stephen Harper won in 2013 or 2012, whenever that was.
Invitation for years, and it has never been accepted by the NDP or any other party.
All right,
it's
we
great
have
to hear that
we
they
have to
agree,
wrap
but
this section now, leaders. It is time for me, with great pleasure, to welcome Mercedes Stevenson of Global News. She is joining us now, and she's going to be asking each of you a direct question on climate change. This round starts with Mr. Trudeau. Hi, Mercedes.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hello, candidates. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to ask you about a question that is on a lot of Canadians' minds, the question of climate change. Mr. Trudeau, starting with you. On your watch, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have gone up every year since 2016, giving this country the worst emissions reduction record in the G7. According to the most recent data from your government, Canada's emissions in 2019 were just as high as they were 15 years ago. Environmentalists say that your performance is insufficient. If you're so serious about climate change, why are Canada's emissions still going up?
We inherited a government from a Conservatives that did not believe in the fight against climate change, and we had a lot of catching up to do. But what we were able to do in 6 years is bring a national price on pollution, ban single-use plastics, move forward in protecting more of our coasts and oceans and rivers than any government in history. And we are right now on track to exceeding those 2030 targets set at the beginning at Paris, down to 36%. And we've gone even further with that, with a concrete plan that the experts have said is the only one that can achieve a 40%
Which they say
reduction.
you're unlikely to meet.
That is what we're dealing with.
Okay, Mr. Trudeau.
I mean, it's not the worst record,
Madame.
Your party often criticizes the oil and gas industry in Canada's western provinces. You've said that you would block pipelines trying to go through Quebec. While you were the environment minister, though, you allowed oil exploration and carbon-intensive projects without environmental assessment. So why the double standard, and what do you say to Canadians who feel that you're blocking their prosperity?
There were 3 issues that have been raised since I've been into this election. First one is having reversed the 9B line of Enbridge, which had been reversed a few years sooner without any evaluation or anything. Second one is a project in Baie des Chaleurs, which already had been submitted to an evaluation, an environmental evaluation. And the other one was to have an environmental, I will come to that, evaluation after the exploration. This is all a build-up made by the previously environmentalist Stephen Guilbeault from the Parti libéral, which the Prime Minister did not even know about when he attacked me with it. My record is also having signed the carbon market with California, which is still considered the best way to tackle the gas emission through incentives and tariffs around, I wouldn't say the world,
All right,
at
Mr.
least North
Blanchet,
America.
That is time. Mercedes, your next question.
Mr. O'Toole, you're next. Under your plan, Canada would abandon its current climate target. Instead, you would settle for a weaker one. In fact, it's one set 6 years ago by Stephen Harper. World leaders are meeting this fall to ratchet up their commitments on climate change on the global stage, yet you would walk ours back. You've said that climate change is real and you've endorsed carbon pricing, but your target is the lowest of all of the major parties who are here tonight. Why should Canadians settle for your plan and a plan that would take our targets back in time?
Because Canadians deserve to have a plan and leadership to make the targets. Mr. Trudeau went to Paris. The targets I'm talking about making are the ones he signed on to, and then for 6 years did not make them. He likes to blame everyone else but himself for action. So what we did, because as I said, Mercedes, we have to build trust on this issue, we went out and worked with the top consultancy in the country to come up with a plan to price carbon, to get our emissions down to meet Paris, but to also get people back to work. After COVID-19, with $500 billion worth of debt put on by Mr. Trudeau, with a cost of living crisis, we also need to have a strong economy to get our emissions down. We will make our emission targets, and I think it's important for Canada to have a plan to meet.
Frick, dude.
What time is it?
It's freaking 6. I got like 10 more minutes. Okay. Oh, no. It's only 3.
348. Yeah, you got it out.
Yeah, I got that one. All right. Never mind, right?
What it signs on to internationally.
Ms. Paul of the Green Party, obviously environment a big focus in your plan, calls for a 60% reduction in Canada's emissions by the year 2030. Other countries that are making that commitment don't face the same challenges that we do here in Canada. We live in a cold, northern, sprawling country, and our economy still relies on resource extraction, much of which you've said you would shut down completely in your platform. How would you offset the economic harm that would result from meeting such an aggressive target?
Thanks for the question. And first, let me say that when I think about our future and I think about the future of energy, Canada will remain an energy superpower, but we will be a renewable energy superpower. And I think about my brother who was a roughneck out on the oil patch until the bust during the pandemic. And I think about his future, and I know that we have got to diversify our economy. But I tell the people of Canada today that what happens next is really up to you. We can keep moving towards a mirage, and that is what these promises are, a mirage that's just out there in the distance that we never arrive at. Or you can send people back to Ottawa from every single party who are committed to working together across party lines on the greatest existential challenge of our time and seizing the opportunity of a truly green recovery.
Mr. Singh, you accuse the Trudeau government of being all talk and no action when it comes to climate change, and yet you won't even give Canadians a straight answer on whether or not you would cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. You've had years as NDP leader to develop a climate plan. Your platform has lots of big ideas and big targets, but almost no details on how you would get there. Don't you owe Canadians a clear answer on your climate roadmap, and will you provide one tonight?
No, I don't.
Absolutely, and I'm honored to do so. We've got a bold plan that's going to take a lot of courage, that requires lots of investment, because we know how serious this crisis is. And we know what we're up against. Unlike Mr. Trudeau, we're not going to blame previous governments. We know that in power, we have the power to make a change. And if we vote for the same things, we're going to get the same results. So I want Canadians to know you have a choice. We are committed to ending.
But what is your plan, sir?
We'll lay some of it out. One of it is to end fossil fuel subsidies, use that to invest in clean energy. We would make sure we prioritize investing in electrified transportation. We would invest in retrofitting homes and buildings to reduce our emissions. There is so much that we can do. We are confident we can do it. But there is a cost if we continue down the same path of conservative or liberals who don't take this seriously. You have a choice.
I think that's an important
All right. Thank you. Now it is time for open debate. Mercedes is going to keep you leaders on theme. I'm going to keep you on time and make sure everyone has a chance to be heard. Ms. Paul, we're starting with you. Back to you, Mercedes.
Thank you. Canadians want their government to fight climate change, but they also worry about the cost for their families. And we know there will be a cost to this. Why should Canadians trust your party to see us through this?
There is a global green rush going on now to create the competitive green economy of the future. What the Greens don't want to see is Canada being left behind, because that is exactly what's happening. You know, I'm sure that the last candle maker was the person that had the market cornered on candle making, but if everyone has moved on to LED lights, then you're in trouble. And so what we want to see is us seizing this opportunity. And Mercedes, to your earlier question, if Denmark and Greenland, other cold countries, can end oil exploration, then certainly we can do it. And if 27 countries in the European Union can come together collaboratively to have an ambitious plan for the climate, then surely with leadership, we can do the same here in Canada. I know Canada can do anything that any other country can do.
Absolutely. I think we absolutely can.
If any type of energy is removed from the global market, Canadian energy, it's replaced by a bad actor country that doesn't have carbon reduction programs, it doesn't have human rights, it doesn't have engagement with Indigenous communities. Indigenous partnerships in natural resources is huge. So you said the cost. There are tens of thousands of jobs that deserve an economic recovery just as much as anyone else. There are Indigenous partnerships, economic reconciliation, and a move towards a made in Canada net zero by 2050. So let's be leaders in getting carbon emissions down and being world leaders on how we have natural resources, whether it's energy, timber, rare earth minerals for EVs, then we can be world leaders again.
Let's talk about the cost. The cost of inaction is an entire town of Lytton being wiped out by a climate forest fire. The cost of inaction is forest fires and flooding and heat waves that mean Canadians lose their lives. The cost of not acting means a young woman I met in Hamilton who looked me in the eyes and said, what's the point of me pursuing my education? What's the point of me finding a partner or even starting a family when I don't know what type of future I'll live in, let alone my child? That's the cost of inaction. That's the cost of Mr. Trudeau, who had 6 years to do something about this.
Again,
it's not 2 years. It's not a small mandate. 6 years, and he failed you, and it cost all of us.
Mr. Trudeau.
When we talk about a climate crisis, we have to deal in facts. And one of the facts I need to correct right now that everyone is laid into is we have not missed any of our targets. We are on track to exceeding our targets. And it's important that we are on facts. Secondly, I do have a question for Mr. Singh. We need to talk about science. We need to talk about experts. We agree on that, you and I both. So how is it that the experts that have rated our plan on climate to be an A have rated your plan to be an F?
Experts.
I rate your track record an F, Mr. Trudeau. You've had 6 years.
You don't get to rate.
I rate
politicians, experts. Why did the experts give you an F on your climate plan?
Let's talk about right now. Let me respond to this. Let's talk. You're talking about the future. Let's talk about right now. You had 6 years.
Why did you get
let me finish. Let me finish. You've got the worst track record in all the G7 after 6 years. How can people trust you?
Why didn't you put forward an ambition?
Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, then Ms. Paul, then Mr. Blanchard.
I don't accept that, first of all. I don't accept that at all. We've got a bold
hold on,
plan
Ms. Paul.
and a strong plan.
Mr. Singh, thank you very much, Mr. Trudeau.
You get heated about these things.
He cannot explain why his plan is being panned by experts. Now, every politician up here says, we have the best plan. We actually have a record. And what Mercedes' question was, how do we make sure it's affordable? We brought in a price on pollution across the country that puts more money back in the pockets in the provinces where it had to be imposed because conservative politicians fought against it every step of the way.
Ms. Paul,
with the greatest of respect, I think the 5 PhDs in our shadow cabinet who put together our green recovery policy would disagree with you, with the experts. But I do want to say more generally that, again, this is getting us nowhere. We have got to be able to come together across party lines, not only to face the existential crisis that Mr. Singh described, but also to seize the greatest economic opportunity that Canada has seen within our lifetimes. We are being left behind. And if the United States can do it, if the Europe...
I just want to ask, why does she think that Canada is going to be at the top of this green energy boom? Because green energy right now focuses on essentially wind and solar and maybe geothermal and some hydroelectric. Canada maybe has hydroelectric. Geothermal, I'm not particularly sure. I don't think it's super seismically active. Wind, yeah, maybe along the coast. Solar, no fucking way. So, like, maybe technologically, like, in terms of developing, like, solar panels or building wind turbines, but honestly, that's, like, heavy industry. That's, like, those are not growth industries. Those are the kinds of industries that are going to be taken up by countries like Vietnam, like, interested in heavy industry that's very polluting and lots of steel required. Not Canada, where people want $100,000 a year jobs.
Yeah, I think like you said, like developing the technology could be, and I saw
could be, but China's already done most. I mean, there's not like new.
You could improve it and make it better. And I saw plans from, I think it was from Bernie, basically saying that we could create these technologies and then like work with other countries to like basically have them buy it or rent the rights from it for us, which could potentially make the country a lot of money.
I mean, it could.
But yeah, like you're saying, manufacturer. I don't think there's going to be a lot of manufacturing jobs coming to Canada.
It's also very difficult, and it's difficult in general to drive any industry to innovate in whatever field you want it to innovate in. And there are probably much higher growth industries than green energy, where like you get the 1 in a million chance that you somehow develop a better material for a solar panel or slightly more efficient turbine in a wind turbine. Like these are not really high technologies, and these aren't really high. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of production, but in terms of like the actual intellectual property, I don't I don't share their enthusiasm for the value of that, honestly.
I think some of it also, it could be like, it's like gonna have to, if they want to meet a lot of these carbon needs, there's gonna be a lot of like retrofitting and stuff that needs to go. I think
Retrofitting, yeah.
I think a lot of people.
Yeah, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about
infrastructure.
They're talking about a green, basically being on the new wave of this green energy thing. Like retrofitting homes that's like basically a one-off thing. That's not like a long-term economic future for a highly developed country.
It will require maintenance though, but similar to your statement that people don't want to work, they want to work for like a $100K a year job.
Especially Canada, where most people are university graduates.
If you don't,
if you don't
increase the salaries for some of these, a lot of people aren't going to want to do them. But one, there's of course the installation will be like a big boom and then it'll slow down. But there will be maintenance, and also if you do things like improving infrastructure, that stuff is always going to require maintenance. And like, I mean, you look at the United States, we're always doing maintenance, and even though we do a terrible job, we still get like a C- on our infrastructure.
Right, but I mean, you could say that about infrastructure in general, but what she's talking about is replacing an entire industry with infrastructure maintenance. I think her idea is that it's gonna like take off in terms of like a new production economy, and it's not particularly suitable for a highly educated population.
I think they need to also well, if she's talking about like replacing these industries like the oil and stuff,
that's
like,
basically what she's implying, I think.
Well, it depends. She's probably focusing on people like she said her brother is, or I think it was her brother, is a roughneck. Like there does need to be, and I'm not saying they have she's making a good argument for this, but there needs to be a real conversation about what to do with those people.
The people and their labor, that's one aspect, but there's another aspect, which is the sheer amount of revenue that comes from selling oil. So like you can get those people new jobs. That's a totally separate issue from the huge loss in tax revenue and frankly the amount of profit that these companies are making that's going to damage the tax base for the Canadian economy as well if they stop producing oil.
Well,
and it's going to be difficult to replace that with heavy industry producing highly polluting solar panels.
Yeah. I mean, I think one, I wouldn't worry about the money too much because money isn't real. But
then why? But that they are worried about. That's why they're having this discussion at all.
I know,
because they're worried about money.
But that's what I'm saying. Personally, I mean, I wouldn't really worry about it at all.
Yeah, but you have to address the question here. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would say money isn't real.
That's what you would say?
No, of course not. But you could say like, yeah, we're going to diversify into other things. It doesn't have to be like one industry switch just to one other thing. We could diversify. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. And of course, that's going to be a big issue for people. It's like, oh, we're losing all this revenue. Well, it's like, well, like I said, I just don't think it's like that big of a deal. But yeah, some of it can go to green technology. Like you said, not a lot of it's going to be like manufacturing. So it's not going to be a huge boom, I don't think. But I don't know. Find other places where there's not enough push, whether that's like public health or safety or something. I mean, I think arguing like this is just going to become, we're going to go from like the non-renewable energy sector and flip into green. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that's a legitimate argument, but I also don't think that we have to do this like one-to-one thing where it's like,
yeah, I think she's making a mistake. But she's trying to simplify it.
I think a lot of politicians also do this though. It's an easy way to simplify it. Just go, oh, we'll just change it into green energy jobs, and it's like, well,
yeah,
it's not like it's de facto not the same because like it's not like a thing you're just pulling out of the ground. It's like it's manufactured. I mean, there's refinement and stuff, but whatever.
Yeah, I agree. It's a sloppy tool, but
it's a little bit reductive.
European Union can do it. I know that we can do it. It's about a change in the culture.
All right, thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Blanchette, did you want to get in?
The clock shows that I'm quite behind everybody else, and I have 12 seconds left.
Take some time,
I will disagree
sir.
with the basic statement. There's possibility to create more wealth to absorb the cost of the changes that we need. We must stop opposing environment and creating wealth. It may go together well. This is the change that we have to do.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mercedes.
Well, that wasn't a great point.
And now, leaders, we are moving on to our next theme, reconciliation.
I assume it's with the
Now we are going to our first-time voter, Merrick McLeod in Sault Ste. Marie. He's got a question to all the leaders. Merrick, you're 18 years old. You're a first-time voter. What is your question to the leaders? Go ahead, Merrick. The leaders are listening.
Ani Bojo. In the Ojibwe culture, trust and respect is key to any relationship. Oh, shoot.
You got it, Merrick.
Shit.
Keep going.
How can I trust and respect the federal government after 150 plus years of lies and abuse to my people? And as Prime Minister, what will you do to rebuild the trust between First Nations and the federal government?
Thank you, Merrick. Leaders, you've heard the question. How do you respond to Merrick? Mr. Trudeau, you start this round.
Thank you, Merrick, for your question. You're absolutely right. Over the past 150 years, Canada has failed in its relationship with Indigenous peoples. People who we should be working with in shared stewardship of the land, working with in partnership as we draw from the bounty and the beauty of this land to build a better future for all. That is why over the past 6 years, we have stepped up on the path of reconciliation. We have ended boil water advisories in 109 different communities. We have made sure that tens of thousands of young people get to go to school in better classrooms. We continue to move forward on fighting fighting for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and ensuring a true partnership as we move forward in respect.
Mr. Blanchet.
Your question is quite moving. I would say that no one is entitled to tell any nation what to do or what to think, and that every nation has to be recognized as such. Either it is a nation of 300 people, like there is in Quebec, or an 8 million people nation like Quebec is. It calls for a relationship between equals. It calls for a relationship in which nobody tells the other party that they are stronger, bigger, richer, and therefore you will do as you are told, even if we say it politely. And first, you provide clean water to everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Ms. Paul.
Yes, and thank you so much for the question, and I understand the anguish in it as well, because justice delayed is justice denied. And coming from a diaspora myself, where we have been robbed of our culture, of our languages, of our history, I have no idea where my ancestors were born or where they're buried. I completely understand how important this is and how frustrating it is not to have seen the action. I am tired of being up on these stages without Indigenous leadership here to speak for itself. Jody Wilson-Raybould, Mumalak Kalak, I'm thinking of you right now. And when Ms. Kakak said that without action, that the Parliament would be hollow, she was right. So Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, nation-to-nation engagement, that is my commitment.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. McLeod, thank you for the question. And the way you phrased it is so important. Reconciliation is about trust and respect and restoring it after a century and a half of a federal government failing. That's why, as opposition leader, my first question when I rose in the House of Commons was on a call to action.
Pause it for you, man. Okay.
Action on reconciliation with respect to Indigenous health. We need to build partnerships. We need to restore trust. And that trust is eroded when you make commitments on safe drinking water on reserve, when you make commitments on the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report and have no plan to fulfill them. So I want to build partnerships and have Indigenous leaders have governance over the federal government finally delivering on our commitment to Indigenous peoples.
Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Merrick. Thank you for your question. How to restore trust? How do you restore trust when Indigenous communities suffer injustice and it continues in an unbroken line to this very day? How do you restore trust when you've got a prime minister that takes a knee one day and then takes Indigenous kids to court the next? And how do you restore trust in a country as wealthy as ours, a G7 nation in the 21st century, that still does not provide clean drinking water to every single Indigenous nation? It starts by actually walking the path of reconciliation, not with the empty words, but real action, clean water, nation to nation, and respect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singh. Merrick, did the leaders answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. Messieurs Blanchette and O'Toole, it is your turn to debate now. You've promised more money to search for unmarked graves, but so much more needs to be done to achieve meaningful reconciliation. Mr. Blanchette, you begin. Tell me, how are you better positioned than Mr. O'Toole to restore justice?
I am not better positioned than Mr. O'Toole because I believe that this is a relationship between nations. And, you know, your presence a nation, I feel I represent another one, and we are discussing with a lot of other nations. But I will remind everybody that on the last day of the last session, we had a motion adopted unanimously by the Parliament, and this motion was precisely saying what we had been told to carry by the First Nation leaders, and we had it adopted. This might be the way to do it. Many times the Bloc Québécois said, even if we don't agree with everything, that we would share our seats and our voices in the Parliament with the First Nations in order to have them being heard by the whole country.
After the tragic finding of graves in Kamloops, Cowessess, and other former residential school sites, we offered to work in a bipartisan fashion on calls to action 71 to 76. Those are related to former residential school sites. And we need to act faster. I know Mr. Trudeau cares a great deal about reconciliation. I know we all do. But this is an issue where we have to act. We can no longer say that we recognize the calls to action. We need a plan to achieve them. And what I'm proposing is a plan that builds partnerships, that builds governance, that has Indigenous leaders, incredible ones like Jody Wilson-Raybould, to allow us to actually hold ourselves to account. All parties, all future governments. This is the biggest scar in the history of Canada. And we have to tackle it not just with good intentions, but with a good plan to deliver for all Indigenous people.
Mr. Blanchette,
I must
briefly.
say that the Prime Minister has nominated Gouverneur Général, I don't know how to translate that, who speaks Inuktitut, which is great, but does not speak French. Still, he does not agree with the idea of acknowledging, recognizing First Nation languages as official languages in his country.
All right, we will leave that segment there. Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, you're up. Tell me, what is your plan to end the ongoing disproportionate violence against Indigenous women and girls? Ms. Paul.
The first thing is to make space for Indigenous leadership because, you know, we have done all these things and made all these promises. We know what needs to be done. The recommendations are there in the calls for justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, and yet we still don't have the action. And so, as I said before, it should be Jody up here answering that question. It should be Mumala Kakak up here answering that question. We need to make the space for Indigenous leadership to guide this process, and above all, we need to make this a priority. All that is left now is political will.
But that is exactly what we have been doing, Ms. Paul. When we called the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls after years of governments avoiding doing that, we ensured that we brought the truth forward. And then we worked with Indigenous leaders groups, Indigenous women's groups to co-develop the action plan that we are now fully funding so we can get justice for the victims, healing for the families, and put an end to this ongoing national tragedy. It will take a lot of work by all of us, but we are walking this road in partnership because we know it needs to be done and there is much more to do.
But Mr. Trudeau, sadly, and this, I don't take any pleasure in this, the calls to justice are out there and you haven't acted on them. And I meant it when I said you can't take a knee one day if you're going to take Indigenous kids to court the next. That's not leadership.
Mr. Singh,
that's
you love that line about taking Indigenous kids to court. It's actually not true. We have committed to compensating those kids who went through that.
Listen,
and it's more than that. This is important, Mr. Singh.
No, you can't say you're not taking them to court when you're taking them to court.
When you talk
there
about
are kids out there that are being fought by you in court.
Leaders, I would actually remind you the question is about violence against Indigenous women and girls. Let me recenter you on that.
I appreciate it because he can't continue to say that. That doesn't make any sense.
And Ms. Curl, I will say again, I said this last night in the French debate, this is why we need more diversity in politics. This is why we need people to be, who are most directly impacted by issues to be able to speak for themselves. Because we are drifting off into things. We have only dedicated 2 minutes to talking about how we are going to bring true justice to Indigenous women in this country. If we could stick to the topic.
Mr. Trudeau.
Ms. Curl, on this topic, and it was brought up in the earlier one, and we talked about Indigenous women, I want to talk about those kids buried in unmarked graves across the country, because it was a tragedy for all Canadians, one long known by Indigenous peoples. But when I went to Cowessess to speak with Chief Cadmus Delorme, we not only grieved those kids, we signed an agreement, a landmark agreement, to keep kids at risk in their communities, to take them out of the provincial system. That is how we move forward. It took years to sign that agreement, but we got it, and we are empowering Indigenous communities to care for their own kids. Mr. Trudeau, we're out of time. Mr.
Singh, I'm going to give you very brief moment to respond. Briefly, we're over time.
We need to implement all the calls to justice. We need to listen to Indigenous women and girls. We need to make sure that they're safe, and we have the steps that they've laid out that we need to follow.
All right, thank you very much, leaders. Now I'm really pleased to welcome Melissa Ridgeon of APTN News. Melissa is going to be asking you each a direct question on our theme of reconciliation. Your first question, hi Melissa, is to Mr. Blanchette. Over to you.
Tanshe, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with you to ask some questions for our APTN audience. Mr. Blanchette, I'm going to start with you. You know, numerous government reports, including in Quebec, have sounded the alarm that systemic racism exists, from Joyce Echequan dying as she's taunted by hospital staff, to policing, the justice system. What will you do as Bloc leader to address systemic racism in your own province in Quebec and also elsewhere in Canada?
First, never underestimate the weight, the sadness of those dramas. Second, I acknowledge, I recognize the existence of systemic racism in June 2020. And then, what happened? It became a political tool against Quebec. It became a tool to say Quebec is this and that and racist and xenophobic and all of that, instead of opening a discussion, trying to find solution, consulting experts, discussing with the First Nations themselves. It became this white society against this other one, white society. We build nothing, so the words became toxic. I'm absolutely open to the idea of discussing all of that on a quiet stage without this aggressivity, being aggressive as this debate has become.
All right, Mr. Blanchette, we have to move on. Your next question, Melissa.
This question's for you, Ms. Paul. You know, Canada has more children in government custody right now than at the height of residential schools. New legislation, child welfare legislation, actually takes the onus on and puts it on the First Nations communities to bring their kids back, cleaning up the mess that Canada has created, essentially. And those children are going to have to be brought back to all of those same problems that still exist, that were the grounds for apprehension. What would you do in the House of Commons to make sure that poverty and trauma issues are addressed?
Flowery jacket.
Thank you very much for that question, and absolutely, we mentioned that not that long ago in one of our statements that the residential school system had been replaced by children in care, and that this was just perpetuating the legacy of trauma. It really comes back to what I said before, which is that the Indigenous leadership is there. It is ready to guide all of these processes. We have all of the recommendations we need. What we are missing is political will. What we are missing is those who have been in power for a very long time, making space for new voices and diverse voices. I actually had to pull my jaw up, which just dropped, when I heard what Mr. Blanchette said. I invited Mr. Blanchette to get educated about systemic discrimination. I extend that invitation again. I would be happy to educate him.
It's nice to want to educate me.
This is my time, sir.
It is.
Thank you.
Nice time to insult people.
That was not an insult. It was an invitation to educate yourself.
This is leader direct questions.
There
Melissa,
should be some
Mr.
decency in this debate. Since
I
I'm many minutes behind everybody else, there should be some
Mr.
decency
Blanchet, you
in
have
the
had
debate.
every opportunity to
It's
jump
your
in an open
responsibility,
debate.
not mine, but some things
And
cannot
I
be
am
said.
fulfilling my responsibility, sir. Melissa, we're going to keep moving on.
It
is your turn.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau, this is for you. You know, your Liberal government has turned Indian affairs into two separate massive bureaucracies that eat up large portions of funding that will never see it on to reserve. It doesn't leave the bureaucracy. You know, you've promised clean drinking water, but billions of dollars later, that's not happened. Many still do not have clean drinking water. You know, Canadians and Indigenous people are losing patience with the lack of results from all of this spending. So I guess the question is, why would they believe you this a third term that they would get results and you would be accountable for all that spending?
One of the enemies of progressive politics, Melissa, is cynicism. Is discounting the hard work that millions of people have been involved in over the past years. And yes, there's always more to do. Progressives always know there's more to do. But when we came into office, there were 105 long-term boil water advisories. We lifted 109 of them, and for each of the ones that are remaining, we have a project lead, a project team, and an action plan, and we're going to lift those all. There are tens of thousands of kids across this country, Indigenous kids, who've started the school year in new schools or refurbished schools. We have moved forward on settling more agreements and more land claims and more partnerships than any other government over the years. We continue to work in partnership and respect and invest more money in Indigenous communities than any previous government. And no, we're not done yet.
I think the money, I don't think anybody's questioning the money spent. I think that they're questioning the results for the money that's spent. My next question is to you, Mr. Singh. You know, federal forces, including the RCMP and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have been used throughout Canada's history to prevent First Nations from exercising their treaty rights to fish and to hunt and to defend land and water. This is happening right now on both coasts, including under the NDP party in British Columbia with regards to fishing and logging. So my question would be to you, as Prime Minister, what would you do to ensure Indigenous rights and title are finally respected in this country?
I really appreciate the question. First of all, we need to respect
it's not a debate
Indigenous
between him and the
treaty,
NDP.
land,
it's a debate
rights.
between
That's a fundamental step towards walking the path of reconciliation in a real meaningful way. But you mentioned the RCMP, and I got to talk about the really sad reality that there's been violence, heavy-handed violence against Indigenous communities, against peaceful protesters, and I have long called for reform of policing. When I was in the provincial level, I fought against carting. I've continued to use every platform I have to say we've got to stop the use of force, we've got to overview it, we've got to change the RCMP's mandate. And that's something we can do at the federal level. That's something that Mr. Trudeau said he would do and yet has yet to do. And it's something I'm committed to making sure happens.
Mr. O'Toole, next question is for you. You know, you voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that would share decision-making power with Indigenous people over what happens on their land, and you also want to criminalize Indigenous dissent that's expressed through blockades or protests. So the question is, if you're Prime Minister, how could Canada build a respectful nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people?
Thank you, Ms. Ridgen. And this goes very similar to Mr. McLeod's question on trust and respect. I want to build those partnerships. And that's why our only concern with the United Nations Declaration was how free and prior informed consent was defined so that it didn't stop partnerships from being formed. I'm really glad to say one of the early leaders behind the UN Declaration, Chief Willie Littlechild, has agreed to serve as a special counsel to me on the implementation of that to make sure that there are partnerships and opportunities. What I want to do as Prime Minister is build that type of nation-to-nation dialogue and partnership so that the next generation has intergenerational wealth and opportunity transfer, not trauma. And building that trust will be core to me. It's why, as I said, my first question was on reconciliation. We have to make progress.
All right, thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Now we move on to open debate. A reminder that Melissa will be here to keep the leaders on theme. I will be here to do my best to keep you on time. And all of you have an opportunity to jump in after Mr. Trudeau begins. with a question from Melissa.
Okay, I think if there's one thing that Canadians and Indigenous people can all agree upon, it is that this Indian Act system is not working for anybody. How would you dismantle this broken top-down system, and what would you replace it with that would ensure that Canada still is living up to its constitutional obligations to Indigenous people?
First of all, we are looking forward to dismantling the Indian Act. It is a commitment of ours, but it is not something that Ottawa gets to decide. And what replaces the Indian Act will vary from community to community as we live up to our obligations. And that's why over the years, as we've moved towards self-government, we have accompanied communities, some who want to start with health, some who want to start with education, some who want to start with economic development. Every community, every nation across this country gets to help define what its path is forward. We will be there to listen, to partner, to build a better future every step of the way.
The way to go forward is to listen to leaders. And Mr. Trudeau ignored one that he had in his own cabinet, in Jody Wilson-Raybould. That was a huge lost opportunity. We've been speaking to people with how we can accelerate treaty resolution. There are some treaty negotiations, Ms. Ridgen, that have been going on, as you probably know, for decades. We need to solve it, and we need to work with Indigenous leaders. There's incredible Indigenous leaders in nonprofits, in the private sector, in industry, in academia. We need to use that governance capacity to finalize treaties and build partnerships. Absolutely. Because the best way forward is success for Indigenous peoples alongside their neighbors, alongside
Mr. Singh and then Mr. Trudeau. I'm coming to you, Mr. Trudeau.
I'll just jump in on this one point. I think absolutely the solution has to be Indigenous-led. And I think that's the starting point. And for a long time, we've seen that there's been a top-down approach that has to change. It has to be Indigenous people at the table. But I want to talk about the impacts, so just so we understand how severe this is, how the Indian Act is creating injustice and perpetuating injustice. I spoke to B, who's a young woman, a young girl who lives in Niskandiga. And she told me in her own voice, she said, I'm a 12-year-old girl and I'm fighting for clean drinking water. How does that make any sense? Those words haunt me to this day. I think about what 12-year-olds do, and they certainly aren't fighting for clean drinking water. That is a legacy. That is the impact of the Indian Act.
I want to go back to what Mr. O'Toole has been saying, because he's very able at saying all the right things, but there are countless examples of him actually not living up to his words. We've seen him on a number of times during this campaign, but on Indigenous issues specifically. He says we need to listen to Indigenous people.
That's why I ask you, what do you think of this nation-to-nation thing? Because the way that I think of America is that the ideal is that you have one national foundation where everyone subscribes to the same culture and ideas, and that's how you form a country, right?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by culture, because I mean, obviously there are
of course subcultures, but you would say that there's an American culture. I would assume, right?
Yeah.
A broader American culture where we hopefully all agree in things like democracy and freedom of speech are kind of the core. It's a political culture above everything. Mm-hmm. And when you start talking about sub-nations within that nation, it almost makes it feel like the people in these First Nations or in America, like whatever, they're Aboriginal nations, exist separately, and that they are not a part of our country. And I wonder how I feel about that. I don't know, because I've never conceptualized it this way before.
I think it's an interesting way to talk about it. I don't know if it would be the way I would go about it, because I mean, I don't know how different it is from like America, where tribes are allowed to essentially like police and rule themselves, but it doesn't seem like they're like, I mean, they're separate like physically in some cases, but
in most cases,
but they're not like, it's not like they have like in a lot of cases like laws that are like anti-American or anything. I don't think, it doesn't seem like like Canadian Indigenous tribes would either, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it, but it's probably not the way I would frame.
Do you think it's sociologically helpful to define them as a separate nation for their well-being, and for Canadians or for American and the American Aboriginal communities to conceive of yourself as being a separate nation, not as an American who happens to be whatever, like in my state, Pima, but a Pima first?
I don't know that it's necessarily helpful. I don't know how destructive it is though either at the same time. It seems like,
I don't know either.
There's a lot of people that identify with like a lot of stuff before they really think of themselves as American. Maybe I don't know. It also depends where it is in your mind. Because I don't know.
Because there's a ranking, I guess, but
yeah, and each person is going to be different.
To me, it kind of just damages the idea of having a unified national culture. And people, there's a lot of shitting on nationalism in the last, couple decades. But I think without a nationalism that like holds together a country like America or Canada or even Taiwan, you've got civil war. I mean, everything falls apart. What holds a country together except for the conception that we all share a culture, we all share a political culture, and we share a future.
Yeah, but I mean, even without this sort of like that sort of thing. I mean, one, I don't know that like just like having these subgroups is going to lead to like literal civil war.
I know that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's like
infighting. Yeah, it's divisive. I mean, by its very nature. So, but I mean, you have that in the United States too, and mostly along two groups that largely consider themselves very American. So, like broadly speaking, like the whatever,
libs.
The
libs and the Christians,
the libs and the rhinos. You have the two groups, and they're like more at war with each other than they have been in probably the past 50, 60 years, and yet they both still have most of these people in like in the I don't know, that would consider themselves like Democrat or Republican. They would also consider themselves like really to like love America and really want to put America first.
Right. But if let's say we started losing that, like if people were like, let's say there were a new debate like for Texas and California nationhood, these things start. I think that would be more destructive. It would start to split these groups even more because they would start to lose whatever limited foundational shared culture they have in the idea of America. But I agree with you that we already split.
I think it definitely could. I don't think that like creating more subgroups is necessarily helpful for this particular issue. But I don't know. I think probably some of the rhetoric may be problematic, but I think it's the most important thing is to make sure that like this state is like taking care of people and making sure that like the issues in these indigenous communities, mostly because of the government, like are dealt with. And I think that would do a lot more to endear these like different subgroups. But on the endear them into feeling like they're Canadians or whatever. But yeah, I think on the issue of like the usage of like nation to nation is interesting. I don't know. I would like to hear because I shouldn't assume anything, but I would like to hear what Indigenous people have to say about that, because they might and kind of legitimately so might view themselves as a separate nation.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. And I also conceptualize it thinking about Quebecois nationalism, the idea that I don't know whether it's helpful to define yourself in that way, because my conception of Canada has always been that it's bilingual, bicultural, but it's still one nation. Everyone's still a Canadian, and we adhere to the same basic principles.
Right.
And there's always this kind of subgroup within Quebec that believes that like language and history trump that and basically should tear that apart. And I think when you give someone national status, you basically open up the door for separatism. I think in the long run, because national self-determination is included in the basically like the UN Charter and the UN Human Rights Declaration. Yeah.
I wonder. Yeah.
National self-determination.
Yeah, I think also that's especially in that case for Quebec, it seems like it's a lot of like ethnocentrism and stuff.
Well, I don't know if it's ethnocentrism. I think it's a shared culture, because the last time I went there, what I found was really interesting. And my dad lived in Montreal in the 1970s and 80s, and at the time there was still like a large Anglophone subculture, especially within Montreal. Lots of, especially like people who were not ethnically French, but over time, because of the rules got so strict, basically they removed ethnicity altogether from it, and they tried to turn everyone there into a francophone. So Canada also has huge amounts of immigration, and what he saw is that they're like basically like first generation Chinese immigrants speaking fluent French on the street. Like basically, they've turned everyone into their culture, and now they're just Quebecois. They're not. It's not like, oh, you don't have a French background, you don't belong here. It's like you adhere to our culture or get the fuck out. Basically, and we're gonna make your life miserable if you can't speak our language.
Which is can also be quite divisive.
So it's definitely, I would say, culturally chauvinistic in some ways, but I don't know about ethnically chauvinistic, because they've definitely pushed integration.
Yeah, that's fair.
Very strongly. Like if anyone who immigrates there, basically, you can get like free French classes for like years to make sure that you integrate fully into the local culture.
Yeah, it's just this weird. I don't know. The focus on like making it like tribal, but I guess everything is like tribal. I guess it's just like we're Quebec. We're not like part of yours. Your territory or whatever. We're different.
Yeah.
Which there's nothing. I mean, differences should be accepted and celebrated, but yeah, like kind of like what we were just talking about. There's got to be some line drawn. There has to be some baseline that we all can agree on. That we all love freedom and democracy.
And does it help to? I mean, why do they absolutely need their own country? I'm not sure. I agree with separatism if you're like a victimized people, but I can't see the Quebecois as like victimized from my perspective. But
I don't know. I would like to hear what their issues are. What they think that they should have their grievances are with the government, basically. Because I don't know. It doesn't seem like, it's not like you have a situation like you have in like Hong Kong or something, or even Taiwan. It's but I don't know. We should find a Quebecer come spew their nationalist stuff.
Maybe not.
Well, he proposed that he would raise the flags that are at half-mast for the kids in unmarked graves in residential schools. And he didn't talk to or listen to any Indigenous leaders when he made that decision. And that's something that is important and symbolic, but wouldn't cost a cent. How do we believe that he would be able to actually make the investment necessary?
Hold on. I'm going to give Ms. Paul and Mr. Blanchet a chance to jump in. We haven't heard from them yet. Time permitting, I'll come back to you, Mr. O'Toole.
And I really again want to
I asked Mr. Trudeau to move immediately.
Hold on, Ms. Paul.
I really just want to try to recenter our conversation on Indigenous peoples and what we are going to do to fulfill the many unfulfilled promises and commitments that have been made. And I would say, perhaps to pick up on what has been said, that it seems all too often that reconciliation is treated like a buffet. You can opt in for this, pick this plate, but not the other one. And that applies to what we've seen with Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals. You can't, on the one hand, say reconciliation and then go and not allow Mi'kmaq fishers to be able to have a decent, moderate living for all of these years. You can't call reconciliation and then take Indigenous peoples to court. But Mr. Singh, you also can't say reconciliation and then support the NDP government in putting pipelines through Indigenous territories, or support Line 5 after the Anishinaabe made it very clear that they did not support that project.
Ms. Paul, I'm going to allow Mr. Blanchet to get in. He's been signaling he wants to.
Yes.
I will come back to the two of you. Mr. Blanchet.
First Nations and Quebec have something in common. They are binded by a document they never signed. And any relationship between nations should be dealt with freely signed treaties or agreements or something. The Indian Act has to be replaced one nation at a time, if need be, by and with freely signed treaties and agreement. There's no other way. And if I may come back a few seconds on something else. Quebec wants religion out of the state affairs because religion never protected equality for women and never will.
We are over time. I'm going to give you both a chance to briefly respond. Mr. O'Toole, then Mr. Singh. Briefly, please.
I am proud of this country, and I think if you love your country, you can dig deep to make it better. So as Prime Minister on the National Day of Reconciliation on September 30th, I will raise the flag with a commitment to move forward on calls to action. Mr. Trudeau promises things, doesn't deliver, and then when people protested him, he mocked them. That is not reconciliation. So you can be proud of your country as you strive for it to get better.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Singh, briefly.
I think that Mr. Trudeau may care. I think he cares. But the reality is that he's often done a lot of things for show and hasn't backed those up with real action. And the harm is that Indigenous people continue to suffer. And that's what I want to stop. I want to stop the suffering and lift up Indigenous people by being allies.
5 seconds, Mr. Trudeau, then we got to go. Mr. Trudeau, 5 seconds.
Unfortunately, the cynicism that Mr. Singh is showing on saying we did nothing is harming reconciliation and the path we're moving forward. We have lots more to do, and we are doing it.
All right, leaders, thank you. Thank you, Melissa.
Marcy.
And now it is time for our fourth theme for the night, affordability.
Oh, hell yeah. Affordability.
It's time now to bring in Janet Falla. She is a senior working part-time in Burlington, Ontario. Good evening, Janet. Please tell us what your question is to the leaders.
4.4%.
Yeah, the U.S. is about 2%.
My question is this: at my age, I never imagined that I would have to keep on working, but I have to afford to live where I do. So I'd like to know, when they become Prime Minister, what will they do to help us seniors survive?
Thank you, Janet. Leaders, you've heard Janet's question. We're starting with you, Mr. Blanchette.
Oh, hell yeah.
Merci, madame. For many months now, the Bloc Québécois has demanded for the government to increase the amount of money being provided on a monthly basis to our elders. It's nowhere in the Conservatives' program, and in the Liberals' program, it starts at 75, nothing below 75 for this pension. I'm not sure about the word in English. It has to be done. Those people are those who suffered the most from the pandemic. Their power to buy things was reduced.
I really like this guy.
The fact that they were alone more than never before was made worse. And the stress, the anxiety they lived with is terrible. We want something to be done, and it has to start with a monthly check, seriously increased.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchette. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Falla, for the question. This is a crisis facing our country. Affordability. And it's hitting our seniors the hardest. That's why in Canada's recovery plan, our plan to give you a break, we're going to double the Canada Workers' Benefit. There are many seniors like you having to work to keep up with the cost of living. We're going to double that for you to give you a break. We're going to get bills down for internet, for cellular phone. We're going to get grocery bills down. That is our plan and our commitment. And in December, we're going to give you a break with the GST holiday and help bricks and mortar stores in the process. Mr. Trudeau is borrowing every day $424 million, and he's causing an inflation crisis. We have to secure our future, and that's our commitment to you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Trudeau.
Ms. Fallish, thank you so much for your question. We know that seniors have been deeply affected by this pandemic, the isolation, the extra costs, which is why we stepped up with a one-time support so you could help get through this.
If you actually think about it, so let's say they moved it down, what would your proposal be, like 50 or?
Probably not that low. I mean, I'm okay with just doing like a
UBI.
So
UBI is not cheap either, but yeah, they could jack up the taxes.
Not cheap either, but all of these things have been shown that like even we could just redistribution of wealth, because like it's been shown the economies do better when like normal people have more money. Like, and I mean, you know, you can't be like, oh, it's going to be like a whatever, like you've got to make everyone a millionaire or something. But like just giving them moderately more money where they can live happily, they will go out and spend the money, as opposed to some rich asshole that puts it in a fucking Panamanian bank account.
I think the best way to do that, at least for America, is start by providing universal health care so that people don't have as much of their income lost in that. Absolutely. And probably subsidized healthy foods.
Well, yeah, and also like increase the minimum wage so people can make some more money. Like
I agree.
It's a joke. It hasn't been raised since what, 2008 or something.
It should automatically be tied to inflation. I don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely should be. And yeah, it's bad. Also, the thing is, people always want to say like money doesn't buy happiness and stuff, but there's studies that show it actually does. Up into a point, which is the point is like 70 or 80K.
Yeah, it's not that much.
Which is like, not that much, but it's a lot more than the average American salary.
It's not much higher. The median salary right now is something like 50K, I think.
Yeah, I mean 20K a year is a lot of money though.
Yeah.
That's like a new car.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, but if you're talking about maximizing happiness, like the fact that it's relatively close, it's not. I mean,
I don't know how I'd say how relatively close that is. It is. I'm not saying it's like awful for everyone, but there is a large portion of America that lives very, very close to the poverty line, and
but those people are nowhere near the 50K. I mean, that's
exactly. So that's what I'm saying. We need to raise those people up, and if that takes laws that are like saying like, listen, your CEO can only make 5 times what the lowest paid employee is, I think we should do that. And companies that don't get on board with like actually paying their workers a living wage should just be broken up and fucking.
I mean, I
cast
agree
into
there
the
should be a
ocean.
minimum wage, but I don't know if the minimum wage is going to help with that problem. It will definitely help, but it's not going to solve the massive problem. America's got some serious cultural issues that cause our massive amounts of poverty.
For sure, but I mean, it would go a long way in helping.
It would go some of the way, but I don't know how much. Because if you think about most poverty in America, most impoverished people are fully employed. Like they have jobs and they work.
Exactly, because they don't make enough money at the jobs. That's a big part of the reason why they're unemployed, and also because of housing is a lot of times insanely expensive.
That's a lot more difficult to deal with too, though.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Start from the easy point, which
Start
is
from
just raising wages and giving people health care.
I think food would be easy because we already have food stamps.
Yeah, and taxing the rich to do that stuff. I mean, companies and I'm honestly like getting closer and closer to saying like there's like billionaires just shouldn't exist. I think any if you have like wealth over $1 billion, you should just have to like.
I mean, in principle, I agree, but that's not again. That's like
it's difficult. Like, I know that's difficult to do, but if you
not, that's not what I'm saying. It's not that much money to begin with, and it's not going to have that much of an effect.
I also just don't think that. Again, I always go back to my MMT. Just money doesn't really exist. So
what's MMT?
Modern monetary theory.
Oh well, it does. I mean. It is a fiat currency and it is imaginary, but it is real and like.
Yeah, I know. I say that somewhat flippantly, but it's. I think.
Just to remind all the children at home listening to this, money is partially real.
It's partially real, but it's also partially fake. So, demand that.
Buy gold.
All right, let's keep going. I got us off topic.
This pandemic, but we need longer-term supports. One of the first things we did was increase the guaranteed income supplement for our most vulnerable single seniors when we first got elected. We're doing that again in our proposal in this election. We're also moving forward with increasing the OAS for all seniors over 75 because we recognize that the costs continue to increase as you get older and continue to want to live at home. We're giving you more supports so you can stay at home safely and make those renovations. Importantly, we will continue to have your backs as we have through this pandemic and into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Singh.
You can see it.
I want to thank you so much for your question. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you didn't think you would have to keep on working. And I don't think our seniors should have to work. If seniors want to contribute by working, that's absolutely their right. But you shouldn't have had to work. And in a country as rich as ours, we should make sure our seniors are able to retire with dignity. And you've got the supports necessary to live a life of dignity.
Same fucking problem in America. If you haven't worked, like if you're a housewife, you can't really just collect Social Security. Even if you, so like, that's what he means. Like you should have had to work. Sorry.
Which is also a joke because it's like.
But my grandma gets it. I need to figure out why she's getting Social Security. She did work, but she definitely didn't work for
Social Security fraud. No, I'm just kidding.
She can maybe collect her husband's benefits. Because my grandfather worked, but I don't know.
Well, yeah, but to say like someone didn't work if you're a housewife is like a complete joke. Like taking care of kids is obviously like basically like a job.
Yeah, but it's impossible to monetize that.
Exactly, but so we should just get rid of these stupid like requirements.
Everyone should just get the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Piddling amount.
Exactly. No, exactly.
Enough to survive off of. Make your life just miserable enough to not kill yourself. In your old age. It's a joke, obviously.
Obviously.
Proposing to do is put in.
Just tell me when, man. You got the clock up there.
We got like 3 minutes.
In place.
Oh, you need to do stuff before?
I gotta get ready.
Okay.
A guaranteed income for seniors so they can live with dignity and not have to worry about paying the bills. That's a starting point. What we've seen so far is that Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole both are going to either cut the help that you receive or put the burden back on people like you. We believe that the ultra-rich should pay their fair share for once and invest in you, invest in families, invest in people.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Ms. Paul.
I'm going to be very disappointed.
Thank you very, very much for the question. And as someone who comes from a family where my grandma and grandfather had to work until actually they were kicked out of working because they needed to keep working to afford the basics. I completely understand what you're saying. And this is an opportunity for us to learn the lessons from this pandemic and to really get to the heart of things and to stop talking about the symptoms, but get to the root causes. We need to have, absolutely, and it's so wonderful to see the consensus building around a guaranteed livable income so that whatever your circumstances, you can live with dignity. We need universal long-term care. That's a huge expense. It was for my family. And we need more affordable housing. Let's get to the root causes.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh and Mr. Blanchet, you will both square off now. You both talk about affordable housing.
Because this is about to get into stuff that I'm going to want to watch. All right, folks. We'll be back with you later on. And if you didn't see all of this, it'll be up on the YouTube. Go also to our Patreon, patreon.com/FreeChinaPost, and give us some money and get some goodies. And yeah, make sure to support us. But we'll be back with the second half of this in a little bit. Love ya. FC Pizza.